have Takia Anthony. She's an absolutely marvelous young professor. I actually met her last year when she was still a grad student and at a conference, and she was presenting this paper on the Universal Ethiopian Students Association, 1927 to 1948, Mobilizing Diaspora. And I told her the minute she finished it and had the book published, we would invite her. She's finished it, and we're now happy that she's going to be joining us on the 26th. That's going to be at 3:30 p.m. in the Bull's Head Bookstore, where we do many of our book talks. Following her, we've added one. If you have our newsletter, and please grab one before you leave. This one will not be there. Bill Andrews has a new book that's out, and we're going to be doing a book talk with Bill Andrews, professor of English here at UNC, and that will be at the Bull's Head Bookstore at 3:30 p.m. as well. And then our final book talk will be another UNC alum. I forgot to mention that. Herman Bennett, who's a professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, has a book called African Kings and Black Slaves, Sovereignty and Dispossession in the Early Modern Atlantic. So we're looking forward to having him back with us as well. It's always wonderful to see these folks that went through UNC, went on to make their name in other places, and are now creating the new scholarship that's taking us to places that we had not formerly imagined. There's one additional piece that I will mention. On March 10th, we're going to do a special screening of the film Strange Fruit. And that's going to take place at
Varsity.
Say it again?
The Varsity on Franklin Street.
Varsity Theater, right here on Franklin Street. And that's going to be at 4 p.m. on March 10th. And if you register via Facebook early enough, we'll have a meal there for you as well. So we, of course, once again, this is without charge. Take advantage of this now. If the economy keeps going as it's going, that may not last much longer. So please take advantage of it while we can still afford to do that with you. So now, without further ado, I want to do this small preface because some of you in the audience are very familiar with our guest this evening, but some of you are not. E. Patrick Johnson is also an alum of UNC, and it's always important that when he comes this way, that he comes through UNC, because the Stone Center is one of the places that has a piece of him here. He's one of those folks that advocated for this building, who studied Dr. Stone, and I know someplace that she's smiling down on him today, looking at some of the great work that he's doing at Northwestern, who stole him away from us. In any case, this is the second time that he's come back to do these special kinds of presentations for us. He's on a very, very long East Coast Steel Wheels tour, it looks like, from parts of the South to UNC to New York, and I'm not sure where he goes after that, but we told him we're going to be kind to him tonight. We're going to ask him to speak about 30 to 40 minutes, then we'll do questions, and then we're going to leave time for you to get here to sign your books on the outside. So please join me in welcoming our friend, our son, our brother, E. Patrick Johnson.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It is always great to come back home to the southern part of heaven, and it is always a joy to work with Joseph in doing something at the Stone Center. It's fortuitous that I'm back here again because this is also where I launched Sweet Tea over 10 years ago. It's hard to believe it's been that long, but so it makes sense that we should come back to the Stone Center for Black.Queer.Southern.Women. I also want to acknowledge my mentors who are in the audience, including Dr. Trudia Harris, who was on the faculty here for many years, and has returned momentarily at the National Yankees Center. Also Della Pollack, I think I saw Della here, who was here when I was an undergraduate and introduced me to oral history and performance. And another person who was a colleague of mine but also a mentor is Dr. Sandra Richards, who has retired to the Durham area, so I want to acknowledge him. And also colleagues that I met in Chicago, Dr. Sharon Holland, who's also a great friend, and Ona Lowe, she's also in the book, so check her out. And to all my other colleagues here at UNC, thank you for coming out. And I also want to give a particular shout out to my editor, Mark Sexton-Moss, who shepherded this book through its many iterations and helped me whittle it down from a 1,000-page manuscript. And is always a wonderful ear for me. So thank you, Mark. I thought today, you know, I've been to a number of book talks, and I know that they can be a snore when you're just listening to people read. So I thought I would mix it up a little today. I'm going to read a little bit from the book, but I'm also going to perform a few of the narratives from the book, just to mix things up a little bit. Is that all right with y'all?
It's all right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I thought I'd begin by reading a little bit from the introduction. And God, I'm old enough now and I need glasses to read this small print, so bear with me. During the question and answer session of a performance based on the stories in Sweet Tea, someone once yelled from the audience, "When are you going to write Pink Lemonade? When are you going to tell our story?" Besides being a wonderful title, one that I actually considered, the question, which came from a self-identified, same-sex loving woman, took me by surprise. Sweet Tea had already been out for 2 years, and I had assumed that someone, one of my colleagues in the field of Black queer studies perhaps, would write a book on the topic. After several more years passed, and after hundreds more women kept asking me when I was going to collect their stories, I decided to do so. But there were also other compelling reasons for collecting the oral histories for this book. I actually wanted to learn more about the interior lives of Southern Black lesbians and their journey toward selfhood in the South. As a child, the concept of lesbian was not in my consciousness, or necessarily in the lexicon of my Western North Carolina Black community. The typical slang of funny, that way, and sissy were certainly common, but mostly were spoken in reference to men who were thought to be gay. I sometimes heard at the barbershop the oblique reference to a woman as a bulldagger, but I had no idea the meaning of that term, only that it was negative. In hindsight, I realized that I actually grew up with quite a few Black lesbians, one of whom is Anita, whose narrative I include in the book. In fact, it was not until I was much older that I realized just how many women in my community were sweet on other women. Thus, I was curious to hear the stories about same-sex desire from these women's early childhood, to see if there were overlaps with Black Southern gay men with whom I have spoken and my own story, or if there were significant differences based on gender. For example, a few of the young girls with whom I was friends growing up were what many would refer to as tomboys. Girls who were more interested in climbing trees, building hot rods, and playing basketball than they were in playing with dolls, playing house, or making mud pies, as I so love to do. I don't recall them being teased about being tomboys, however. I, on the other hand, was often called sissy because of my soft soprano voice, big butt, which I still have, noticeable lisp, and interest in art and girly things. What explains this difference in treatment based on gender expression and play interests? Conducting these interviews gave me some insight and perspective on that question, as many of the women in Black.Queer.Southern.Women revealed that they believe that tomboyish girls are, in general, tolerated, at least until they are of a certain age and expected to become Southern ladies. And even after adulthood, some women, at least in my community growing up, were not bound by a narrow sexual identity when they engaged in non-normative sexual behavior or expressed same-sex desire. While folks may have whispered about them, their dalliances with the same sex did not necessarily make them lesbian as much as it did just another eccentric, whose membership in and contributions to the community outweighed their sexual behavior. One humorous story in this regard involves my now deceased uncle, Johnny Shawman McCaney. For all intents and purposes, Uncle Johnny would have been considered a dirty old man. Although he was married, I can't remember a time when he wasn't flirting with or coming on to a woman. Any woman. Old, young, fat, skinny, toothless. He never seemed to discriminate in his attraction for the other sex. But he definitely had a queer sensibility about him, both in his attraction to non-normative women, in other words, women who did not fit within or even aspire to traditional standards of beauty within the white or black community, and in his linguistic play with gender when he added baby doll to the end of my brother's and my name when he greeted us, as in, how you doing today, Pat, baby doll. While it was mostly an infantilizing gesture, it also queered us in a specific way, and in a way that I loved, but my brothers not so much. Uncle Johnny was always taking pictures at family gatherings and holidays with his Polaroid camera. Y'all remember Polaroids, right? Unsurprisingly, many of the photos were of women guests at our family events or of women whom he had met at his favorite barbershop, where he hung out every day after work and on the weekends. Several years ago, my mother asked him to bring some of the pictures over to our house so that she could look through them and find ones that she could possibly use as a part of a photo collage for an upcoming family reunion. Uncle Johnny arrived with 2 mega-sized trash bag fulls of Polaroid pictures and dumped them onto the kitchen table. My mother, who always has a flair for the dramatic, responded in her off-the-scale, high-pitched voice that starts high and falls dramatically low at the end of a sentence. John, where'd you get all those pictures? Only offering a Mr. Grinch grin. Uncle Johnny ignored my mother's question and proceeded to smooth the pictures out on the table. Mama, my sister Pam, my Aunt Mary Lee, Uncle Johnny, and I sat around the table looking through the pictures, often gasping or giggling at the images emerging from the pile. Mixed in with the photos from past family reunions were pictures of various women, some in compromising positions, scantily clad, or nude, including some of my high school classmates. Aunt Mary Lee stumbled across a picture of Sylvia, a woman who I remembered lived up the street from us when I was a child, and who was the mother of 2 daughters, close to my age. Trying to needle Uncle Johnny, Aunt Mary Lee asked in a voice almost as shrill as her sister's, John, ain't this a picture of Sylvia? Uncle Johnny slipped the picture out of Aunt Mary Lee's hand, studying it as if lost in an erotic reverie. Yeah, that's Sylvia. You know she half and half. Well, if she half and half, what you doing with her then? Aunt Mary Lee responded incredulously. I was with the half I could be with. Uncle Johnny quit without missing a beat. Although totally scandalized and clutching her pearls, even my mother gave in and joined the rest of the room in the uproar of gut-busting laughter. It was my memory of Aunt Mary Lee and Uncle Johnny's repartee and description of Sylvia as half and half, meaning that she had sex with both men and women, that brought into clarity the ways in which Black Southern women's sexual desire, sexual practice, and sexual identity are not always one and the same. As a scholar of gender and sexuality, of course, I know intellectually that this is not the case. But I had not thought about it experientially in the context of my own upbringing and family history until now. Half and half in this context signifies queer sexual desire rather than bisexual or lesbian identity per se. For the phrase exemplifies the verbal play of black folk vernacular that eschews fixed meanings. Aunt Myrtle already knew that Uncle Johnny did not discriminate when it came to women. Thus, she already assumed what he was, quote, doing with Sylvia, and especially given some of the photos of women sprawled across my mother's kitchen table. And Uncle Johnny's coy response about being with only one half of Sylvia also cannot be read literally in terms of him denying a lesbian side of Sylvia in order to be with a straight side. More likely, the half to which Uncle Johnny referred was non-normative sex, given his proclivities for kink. The point here is that Sylvia did not refer to herself as a lesbian, and the community did not project that identity onto her. They only knew that she engaged in queer sex without the encumbrance of a label or identity to accompany this behavior or desire. And as I detail later in the book, this was common among many of the women that I interviewed. While the same phenomenon was true for some of the men I interviewed for Sweet Tea, it was certainly not the dominant narrative, as many of the men typically did identify under some label or category. This phenomenon made me think differently about the particularly vexing problem of how to conduct research on sexuality beyond identity in order to produce a more complex accounting of the history of sexuality and sexual communities. Ultimately, this is why the title of the book does not include the word lesbian. So I go on to talk about, in the rest of the introduction, the complexity of my own positionality as a man conducting these interviews with women. I thought a lot about what the women's response to me would be because of my gender. I thought a lot about the politics of a man collecting oral histories of Black Southern women. And I ultimately decided that for me, engaging in this work would be what I call a Black feminist oral history, Black feminist ethnography, thinking of it as more in methodological terms than necessarily political ones. I want to also acknowledge, while I'm thinking about it, one of the women who is in the book and who has not missed any, and I say any, speaking engagement or performance. Michelle, will you stand up and just wave to everybody? So I'm not sharing Michelle's story tonight, but sometimes I do. And Michelle lives in Winston-Salem, and she sent me this distressed note yesterday saying, Dr. Johnson, I'm not going to be able to make it. I got a test, I can't get off work, I can't get up there. And I was like, it's fine, you've made every one of these things. Then this afternoon, I got my test, I'm coming, I'm going to be there. So I really appreciate you. This next section I'm going to read from is called Walk Like a Man, Talk Like a Woman. And I'm going to then share one of the narratives from this section. I actually think I can see better without my glasses. One of the prevailing stereotypes about lesbian women of any color is that they all, quote, want to be men, or that they are all butch. While many lesbian and queer women have a masculine self-presentation, many others fall among a spectrum of gender presentation. Indeed, many of the women I interviewed speak of crossing many gender boundaries during their lives, some settling on a more constant gender presentation that exists masculine or center, some preferring a highly stylized feminine performance, and others preferring a more fluid gender presentation, or what some refer to as genderqueer. The interesting and surprising discovery for me was the recurring narrative that gender presentation for women in the South, and especially Black women who were working class, was much more fluid than it was commonly thought. Part of this had to do with the work that needed to be performed by children who live in rural areas or on farmlands. Wearing dresses was not practical for feeding animals, milking cows, planting seeds, and a host of other chores around the house. Dresses also did not accommodate the kind of play in which girls could engage in these spaces, such as climbing trees or swimming in a creek. Thus, many narrators believed that being a tomboy did not have the same stigma as being a sissy, because gender-neutral or boys' clothing worn by girls was seen as a practical matter, as opposed to an index of sexual orientation or even preferred gender expression. Nonetheless, the practicality of clothing for some of these women provided a guise for their budding homosexuality. This gendered sartorial freedom was circumscribed by religion and age. No matter what girls wore during the week, on Sundays, they were forced to wear dresses and have their hair done, either in pigtails or crescent curl. And typically, after puberty, these now young women were expected to leave their tomboyish ways behind, including their overalls and pants, present themselves as young ladies, and follow a traditional path to heteronormativity. If that transition to traditional presentation did not occur, it was then that the wages of homophobia descended. What is interesting about this trajectory is how it is caught up in the politics of respectability. One, I might add, that is peculiar to the South because of the way in which it is undergirded by religious doctrine. Once adults and beyond the influence or control of parents and family, these women created even more nuanced self-representations of gender that do and do not index their sexual identity or sexual behavior. These gender markers manifest in the form of dress, language, and sexual roles. What became clear in these interviews, however, is that these codes, while part of a larger symbol system of Black female same-sex desire, do not have stagnant meanings and vary from region to region and from context to context. For instance, what reads as femme in one context reads as soft butch in another. The difference between these two readings of the same gender presentation might come down to the sartorial aesthetic in vogue in one region over another, with the wearing of lipstick by a woman dressed as a dandy marking the slide from soft butch to femme. In general, vernacular terms that index gender performance were far fewer among the women I interviewed than what I found among gay men in Sweet Tea. In fact, there were so many vernacular terms among the men that I had to create an index of the terms for the reader to decipher all of them. For the women, however, the same terms of gender expression recurred across region with very little variation, such as butch, femme, dominant, aggressive, stud, and stem. And stem is kind of a cross between a stud and a femme. These latter terms were more common among younger women, whereas older women usually refer to the traditional terms like dyke or even bulldagger, which for most younger women is offensive. Importantly, none of these terms determines a woman's, need my glasses on. Importantly, none of these terms determines a woman's sexual behavior during sex with another woman. For instance, while a stud presents as masculine, which presumably means that she would prefer to be the top during sex, some self-identified stud narrators were clear that this was not the case. Also, there are aggressive femmes who present as passive in public, but who take on a dominant role in the bedroom. As Lisa recounts, and I'm going to share her story in a second, she was duped by a high femme preacher's wife who used the guise of the church lady to seduce women in the church. So I'm going to share Lisa's story. Watch out for the church ladies. I'm just saying. Lisa was born in Detroit in 1972, but was reared from the age of 1 in Granville, Louisiana. And I met Lisa in Atlanta through actually a narrator from Sweet Tea, Sean, who introduced me to a number of folks. Can someone give me some, where's Joseph?
Right here.
Some water?
She's on the way.
Okay, thank you.
You read your mouth.
Oh, thank you so much. So Lisa's story really tripped me out because I had never heard of church women using the performance of church lady to seduce folks in church. But here we go. In 99, I joined this church, College Hill Baptist Church. We had a Women's Day program, and they asked me to be on the program. So we had 2 services. So I stayed for the second service, and I remember sitting in the back of the church, and I felt like this lady was staring at me. I was like, no, she can't be staring at me. And so the next Wednesday, or a couple of weeks after that, I was at church again. I went to the youth ministry. And this guy was a youth minister, and he was also one of the associate pastors in the church. And so after church, he introduced me to his wife. Well, it was the same woman that was staring at me from the choir stand. I was like, oh, okay. And so the next Sunday, she said, you know what? I need your phone number. I said, well, Sam has my information. You can get it from Sam. She was like, oh, okay. And then it was like casual talk. That following Wednesday at church, she asked me for it again. She said, you know what? I don't got time to fool around with Sam, girl. Give me your phone number. And so I gave her my card and had my little number on it. And the next day, she called me. And she said, you know, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but I'm attracted to you. And she was like, I don't know why. I've never been attracted to a woman before. She did the whole spiel. Now, Susan was a pretty bold woman, very feminine, beautiful, oh my God, petite, very charismatic, you know, and had a voice out of this world. She had it all. She was the total package. She was the total package. So she came to my apartment one Sunday after church. Yeah, she came to my apartment one Sunday after church. You know, we spent the whole day, you know, sitting around, talking, you know, playing around. And the next day, she came back because, you know, I didn't go to work the next day because I was so messed up in the head. And she came over after she got off work, and we ended up having sex. And I'll never forget, Susan said, now once we do this, we can't go back. That's what she told me. And needless to say, God, almost 6 years later, we ended our relationship. Yeah. That story, so that's Lisa's story about being turned out by a preacher's wife. So Lisa goes on in that story to talk about how Susan wasn't just cheating on her husband with her, but with another woman and another man, and then it gets real dramatic because her husband, the preacher, finds out that about somebody, that she's having an affair with somebody because their son overhears her talking to someone saying that she loved them and told his daddy, and then he calls Lisa because they're good friends and said, you know, I think Susan's cheating on me and I'm going to kill her. And Susan's like, oh my God, I'm cheating on her. She's cheating on her, on you with me. So it turns out to be a lot of drama. But that's, you know, one story that's sort of over the top, but there were more women who talked about the church being this place where femmes would use that kind of church lady performance to pull tricks, basically, which was really shocking to me. The next section I'm going to read from is about gender nonconformity. Oh, actually, I'll just share Ida Mae's story, because it's also about gender. Ida Mae was born in Odenville, Alabama in 1951, and I interviewed her in Houston, Texas. And Ida Mae's a trip. She stands about 6 feet tall, and got about 3 gold teeth, and has a voice deeper than mine, and loves telling stories. And she told one of the stories that she shared with me was about how strict her father was with her, because her father was a minister, and how she really resented her father because of how strict he was. So the story I'm going to share with you is about when she got liberated from women's clothing. I didn't want to teach because I didn't want to conform. This whole thing was killing me, this being a girl thing. My mom used to make me wear these long line bras. It's this bra that come way down the hill back in the day. This was before Spanx, okay? Then they had these metal staves in it. Then you had that damn girdle on and it came down the hill, you know, and it had the metal stave in it and a zip up on the side, and then you hooked that to some shit. It was crazy. You know what I'm saying? But that's the way women dressed, and there was no pantyhose, we had stockings. We had to put them up, and then you hook that to some shit. So it was all like, I hated it. I just couldn't conform. I remember when I went to Miles College, we used to always like wear dresses. I was a big girl all my life. I mean, really, I maxed out about 400 to tell you the truth. And when I went to Miles, I was about 350, 450. I was a big girl. And I had these shifts. My mom would always buy shifts for me, and I remember I was standing out there in these little spoon heels, and I was this little fat girl, and that fat was sticking out on the side because, you know, it had that gap on the side, and there was this swishing going on. Every time I take a step, that nylon be going shh, 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 shh. I was the most miserable person in freshman year of college, and I had no pants. My father did not allow us to wear pants, so I had no pants, and I had to shift every damn day with that long line bra and that girdle, and it was killing me. It was killing me, you know. The kids in school started calling me church girl. I didn't know that they referred to me as that behind my back. And then one day I was sitting on the front, on the steps of the student union, and I was sitting up there, you know, I was so uncomfortable trying to read a book, just trying to fit in any goddamn way I could, excuse my language. And I'm sitting, and this guy came and sat beside me, and I still say he saved my life. His name was Frederick. Everybody laughed or looked at or paid attention to Frederick because he had this permed hair. He had this big head of hair that just permed like a woman. And he had his shirt tied up under here, and these cut-off blue jeans, and they were so short you could see the pockets. And he had these little sandals, and he came up, "Yeah, how you doing, church girl?" I'm like, what the fuck you know? I mean, nobody ever, you know, bothered to speak to me. I was just some strange motherfucker walking around. So anyway, I met Frederick, and Frederick sat down and he said, "Church girl, what you up to?" I didn't say much to him. Every day he'd come there, and we just developed a little friendship. So I got a job working work study, and it was kids outside. So when I showed up at 4 o'clock to start my new job, I had on them little shifts and them little teaspoon heels. Frederick said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I come here to work." He said, "Oh, no, honey, we hitting balls and that and shit. You can't come out here." I said, "Well, I ain't got no pants." He said, "Come on." And he took me to Kmart and bought me my first pair of jeans. He bought me a pair of bucks and a shirt and a denim jacket. I went back to school and my titties felt so free when I was taking off all that shit. Frederick was like, woo, woo, you know, he was just cutting up, you know. Why you got on all that stuff? He was just cutting up. Turned out, Frederick was my best friend. I love that story. Frederick also takes her to her first gay bar. Now that was a real experience because she is freaking out because this woman is coming on to her and Frederick is off doing what Frederick does and leaves her by herself, and it ends up being a raid on the club, and they end up going to jail. I mean, it's quite an adventure. But Ida Mae is a wonderful storyteller. In fact, she does storytelling at senior citizen homes. I would want to be a senior citizen to hear her tell a story. All right, so the next section I'm going to read from and then share a story is from the religion section. I'm trying to read this one out of my glasses. Like many African Americans born and raised in the South, I came of age in the church. For me, church was not an option, but rather an expectation for me as it was enforced from the age of 6. Soon after becoming involved in the church through the choir, usher board, vacation Bible school, and the numerous other programs and organizations for youth, including WIC, which stood for While I Can. The church became a place where I did not just have to be, but wanted to be. The mentoring and encouragement I received from adults who were invested in not only my spiritual growth, but also my intellectual and creative growth, fueled in me a passion to succeed. And as I recount in Sweet Tea, the church was also paradoxically encouraged my queer gender expression and budding homosexuality. I assumed, erroneously, that this might be the case for the narrators of Black.Queer.Southern.Women, especially since women comprise the majority of the members of most Black churches. Over the course of interviewing dozens of women, however, I found that the church and spirituality played a very different role in the lives of Black.Queer.Southern women. More often, the women I interviewed speak of having to go to church as young people, but not necessarily enjoying it, or finding the church a refuge, as many of the men in Sweet Tea stated. Beyond developing crushes on their female Sunday school teachers or other women in authority, many narrators were bored in church and, when old enough to make their own decisions about whether to go, chose not to go in pursuit of an alternative form of spirituality. Because the notion of God was tied to a male figure, or because the male leadership of the church upheld sexist interpretations of the Bible, these women sought out forms of worship that were more women-centered, or turned inward to a self-discovery of a communion with a higher power. This alternative consciousness around spirituality was undoubtedly influenced by Black lesbian and women of color feminism of the 1970s and 1980s. Ntozake Shange's choreo poem for colored girls who considered suicide with the rainbow is enough, from which the title of this chapter is drawn, is one of the major texts that begin to reflect what Alice Walker would go on to define as a womanist perspective on spirituality. Shange's Black women characters, who represent different colors of the rainbows, like Lady in Blue, Lady in Red, etc., recount their various struggles with patriarchy and racism throughout the play, which culminates in a communal revelation that God is within each of us, and that they must seek affirmation from an internal female self rather than one external male figure. And in Walker's novel, The Color Purple, the character Suge Avery convinces the protagonist, Celie, that, quote, God is inside you and is inside everybody else. You come into this world with God, but only them that search for it inside find it, end quote. Notably, this view of God as a part of a female self or presence in nature moves beyond the strictly Christian belief system a view that many narrators of this book embrace, whether that be a non-specific belief or an affinity for Buddhism or other non-Western religious forms. On the day I interviewed Julia, for example, her partner was hosting an event called Eternal Summer of the Black Feminist Mind Potluck Series and Queer Black Sunday School, in which Black queer women were gathered in the name of poet Phyllis Wheatley to meditate and share poems. Similarly, Karis Books in Atlanta is cited by more than one of the narrators as being a place that facilitated an alternative spiritual community through the sharing of poetry, literature, and community organizing. And even for those who remained active within traditional Christian Black churches, they found ways to devise transgressive strategies to affirm their sexuality. As briefly mentioned a minute ago and as performed, the stereotypical church lady image prevalent in Black communities is one trope employed by lipstick lesbians to signal same-sex desire within the visual economy of the Black church. So I wanted to share with you the story from Darlene, who is actually anomalous with what I just described. Darlene was born in Fordyce, as she calls it, Arkansas, in 1965, and she is a musician and actually a minister of music. So unlike many of the women that I interviewed, she actually was ensconced in the church. But it's interesting how she negotiated her spirituality and her sexuality. And this is one of the stories that I think Dr. Harris loves to hear. So this is Darlene. As long as I've been a Hudson, I have been in church. That's all my life. I love church. I still love church. I love the singing. I love the hymns. I love hymns now, but back then I just loved the singing. So it ain't a scripture that you can put out there that I don't know, that I don't understand. I think I understand that thing. I really do. I think I'm pretty good. As a matter of fact, my line name when I played Jacob Beta was Revelator. Because I can see things. I believe I was able to look forward in time and predict. So I believe. And with my friends, it was just a big running joke all the time because, you know, every time the Revelator said something, it almost came to pass. So I want you to understand that there never was a closet that I was in. It was more of an awareness that I had to come into. And I thank God how things have progressed in my life and how things have evolved. Yeah, maybe that's a better word. How they evolved in my life. Because I got my teachers in the church. I got my teachers in the church first. So when this stuff came about, the Leviticus and man not laying with man, I had to take it in the way that it was taught to me, in the context that it was taught to me. This is the Old Testament. These were the rules that they had in place. Christ came not to do away with, but to make you where you can fulfill the promises or you can fulfill his covenant. So I don't say it's not true. I just got to understand it in the context of the day and time, you know, who they were talking to. And I understand that everybody who was writing in the Bible wasn't so saved and sanctified themselves. You know, they had their own isms, such as Paul. Now, Paul took issue with women. He came into this area where women were speaking all out loud. He wasn't used to that. You know, remember, he was a tax collector. You know, a man of power. So he took issue with that. So he silenced the women. Put something on your head and hush. You know what I'm saying? I put things in context. Now, I kind of understand what was happening in that day and time because, you know, that's what I was taught. Now, this is going on in that day and time. It says something about eating swine. It talks about limbs being missed. There was a reason why these people, you know, had these rules. It was to govern that body of people. I don't think anybody in that day and time had any idea to be rolled forward to become the do's and don'ts of the world, the people that subscribe to it. You know, I live with a Buddhist. She don't subscribe to all that, but I never met a more balanced, believing, affirming person. And maybe she'll get in there and that's where she goes now. You know, somebody getting that Gahanza today. And I don't get up all in that, you know. And, you know, she don't get up in all my stuff. So you got this big Pentecostal woman here and this Buddhist woman here, and you put them powers together, and God has blessed us, you know. The universe has yielded favorably upon us. I got friends who have lost. I got friends who have been foreclosed upon, you know, and God has blessed us. You know, I don't have everything I want, you know, but I ain't broke right now. Right now, I ain't broke. Now, next week, I might be broke. But right now, today, I'm not broke. I used to sing that song. I let nothing separate me from the love of God. I meant that. You know, I told God that when it was time to do this crossover thing, this lesbian thing, I said, let me tell you something right now. If this is going to put me in the hell, I ain't going to do it. So I never forget, it was like New Year's Eve night. It was a turning point for me. This girl had been working me. It was kind of cute. I was kind of liking it. But I told God, before I get too busy, you show me a real clear sign. That's what I told God. Now, all I can tell you, honey, is the way the Lord spoke to me that night. People won't even believe. I told this story about my time of coming out, and so after I had been intimate with this woman, we were laying there, and all of a sudden the radio popped up. You know, it was alarm, and guess what was playing? Oh, it is Jesus. Surely Caesar. I said, thank you. And I ain't never looked back. Can you believe that? Now that's the gospel. That's the gospel according to Darlene. So I love Darlene's story. She is a hoot. And if you ever meet her in person, you'll just be mesmerized by her. She's an activist in Atlanta, and is a wonderful spirit, and she, along with 4 other women, including Michelle, were part of the book launch in Atlanta. There was a panel of them, and it was quite an experience to have that array of women activists be on that panel. And again, Darlene was one of them. I love that story. So I'm going to end here by just reading the last paragraph of the introduction, and then we can open it up for questions. These stories are snapshots of larger lives hidden in plain sight. The silky smooth swearing and touches of drunken fathers, careless brothers, and unrelenting uncles trespass these somatic testimonies, but ultimately falter. For these stories seek refuge and comfort in the love embrace of voluminous breasts, beaded with the sweat of last night's humidity, hot and languid. These tales bend gender towards justice and just us, riding out the new revolutionary wave of femme aggressives and boy bottoms. Ancestral waters flow in the crevices of these stories, awakening a new consciousness about cisness in transition. Promiscuous, these stories get around, hover, and saunter past hegemony's hold on lesbianic meanings as they dip into the honeypot. These stories are of matrilineage. They lord over the erotic. They walk around through summer snow. They say bogus things to throw the dogs off their scent. They will not be undone. They will not be moved. Thank you. Some questions about anything? Yes?
What was the process of choosing the women whose stories you wanted to tell?
One more time. What is the
What was the process of choosing these women whose stories you wanted to tell?
in terms of how I went about collecting or choosing them or both?
Yeah, just sort of all of them.
I actually told this story on the State of Things today, because I get this question a lot about how to find these women and what was the response. So the joke is lesbians are very organized. So it only took a couple of emails that went out over the stories, and I was inundated with women who wanted to tell their stories. And just to give you some sense of that, For Sweet Tea, I interviewed 77 men, and it took over 2.5 years. For Black.Queer.Southern.Women, I interviewed 79 women, and it only took about 16 months. And so I stopped because I had like 4,000 pages of transcript. And so for me, I knew that I had enough material when I started hearing the same stories over and over again, and I had more than enough. I had enough for 3 or 4 books. And editing an oral history is probably the most difficult part because you want to tell all of everybody's story. And it's just not possible, as my editor will tell you, it's not possible. And they're not going to publish it. Also, it increases the cost of a book. So I think Black.Queer.Southern.Women might be 6 pages shorter than Sweet Tea. And that's saying a lot because Sweet Tea is 600 pages. So you have to make some really tough decisions. And so for me, it was about, all right, I've been hearing this theme about gender nonconformity across these narratives. Which ones are unique amongst the whole set of these stories? So that's kind of how I would make those decisions. But one of the other things that happened in the editing process is there were some women's stories that were so compelling that I couldn't make a decision about what to cut out. And so I chose to, based on one of the reviewers for the manuscript, give them their own chapter. And so there are 6 women in the second half of the book where it's most of their entire narrative. Oh, Antonia. Hey.
I saw you do Sweet Tea years ago in Maryland, and then I saw you do a trial run of these stories and oral histories of Black women, and I know that part of what you do is try to embody the stories. Do different things come up with embodying women that with embodying men in terms of how you approach trying to give stories?
Yeah, so even with Sweet Tea, I don't try to, my desire is not to have the audience totally suspend disbelief, because I'm not trying to become any of these people. It's to give you a sense of their voice, so I'm mostly focused on voice. And I, was a little anxious about performing the women's story, and I remember the first time I performed one of these stories in the context of a lecture, and I asked the audience, did you have some cognitive dissonance with seeing me, this male body performing these stories? And they said, no, I was focused on the story. But it's a fine line because you don't want to slip into caricature, which is easy to do. And my check is always the women themselves. For instance, as I said, Michelle has been in everything I've been at. And so if she were to come pull my coattail and say, Dr. Johnson, you got it wrong, or felt that I was misrepresenting them, then I wouldn't do it. But I do think for the performance that will come out of this, I don't see it as a solo piece that I would do. I see it as an ensemble. And in fact, the first reading of these stories happened on this stage in 2014 with 5 women. And I'm thinking that is the way that I want these stories to be in the world of performance. I would still do sort of these kind of things in a lecture, but I don't see myself, again, traveling like I did with Sweet Tea. Yes?
You mentioned the church lady was a bit of a surprise. What were some other surprises that you found when you were analyzing the stories and putting them together?
So many. It's interesting, even though, I'm part of a broader gay community, it's interesting the gender divide between some aspects of Black lesbians and Black gays. So for instance, one way in which there was lots of overlap was, for instance, in Sweet Tea, lesbian women emerged as protectors of gay men who were bullied. And in actually Michelle's story, she talks about gay men teaching her about gaydar and how to beat bass and all of this. So there were those kinds of things. But then there were other parts where I was like, oh, this is real new to me. So the church lady thing was definitely new to me. But also these terms like aggressive and STEM and stud, and how those terms and performances didn't necessarily equate with how one was, their sexual activity in the bedroom. So that was really interesting. Another surprise was, I knew that some women would don't like the term lesbian, prefer other terms, but I didn't expect how strongly some people felt about that term in particular. They felt that it was white identified, or they felt it was too clinical. And then some women were like, I don't identify as anything. All I can tell you is that I'm with this woman. Now tomorrow I might be with a man, but for now I'm with this particular woman. And it put in more crass terms, one woman said to me, because she and her partner have been together for about 10 years now, but when she first saw her partner, she thought she was a Puerto Rican man. And then when she found out that she wasn't a man, she was like, okay, I'm gonna go with this, because I still, am attracted to this woman. But she was very clear to me. She said, if something happens between us, I'm going back to dick. I'm like, okay, all right then. So that was surprising to me. And then the other really big surprise, and again, I think it's owed to my own naivete and my male privilege. I was not prepared for the number of women who told stories about sexual assault and sexual trauma. I interviewed 79 women, and 66 of them told stories about sexual trauma. And that was really shocking to me. And in every case of those 66 instances, except for one, they were all male relatives. So that was really a surprise to me. And then I looked at the national statistics, and then it wasn't a surprise. And this is before the hashtag Me Too movement, because I conducted these interviews in 2012. Yes?
Among queer men, there is still residue or the implications of toxic masculinity. In what way did you witness this among queer identifying women, whether it be toxic masculinity or toxic masculinity?
Did everybody hear the question? No. Can you say it again and use the mic?
So among queer identifying men, there's still the residue of the implications of toxic masculinity. But in what ways did you see this differ, but also converge with it, whether it be toxic masculinity or toxic femininity for queer identifying women?
Yeah. So again, this piggybacks on the response to your question. One of the things that was surprising to me was the amount of domestic violence in some of these women's homes by their partners who were masculine identified. So some of those things that we associate with cis men in terms of toxic masculinity have been taken up by masculine of center partners. But not always. Sometimes it was femmes who were actually a little bit more feisty, as it were, in those settings. So one of the things that this project kind of reinforced for me is that no one can be put in a box, and that the things that we think are set in stone aren't. Because as soon as you place boundaries around something, someone is an anomalous, is an anomaly, and exists outside that boundary. So, you know, again, even though there were a number of domestic situations where a masculine identified woman would be an abuser, or I should say, the woman I was interviewing would narrate a story about their masculine similar partner being an abuser. There were also a number of women who were masculine identified who had been abused by them. So it worked both ways. I think all of these communities have their issues and are working through them. I don't know that I found too many things surprising in these women's community in that regard that I didn't see in some of the male communities when I was interviewing men for Sweet Tea. Yes?
Wasn't your Sweet Tea music video production, theatrical production, nationwide?
Yes, yes.
Did you see this happening with the women's store?
Yes, as I was just saying, I see, yes, but not as a solo show. I feel that it's more of an ensemble piece, and that it should be women performing the stories as an ensemble. But we'll see. You know, I think these things end up being in the world the way they want to be. Because, you know, I didn't even start out when I was doing the interviews for Sweet Tea. I wasn't thinking about a performance at all. If people find that surprising and think I'm lying, then I'm not. I just started meeting so many great storytellers that I knew that the book wouldn't capture all of the verbal tics and the mannerisms and all of that stuff on the page, and that it needed to exist in another form. So then I started performing them, and also now Sweet Tea is going to be a documentary film called Making Sweet Tea that will be out later this fall, and that's yet another iteration of this work. So I think that the work itself, the stories themselves, just lend themselves to different treatments, whether that's a book or a play or a film. And in another version of Black.Queer.Southern.Women that will be out later this year called Honeypot, it's creative nonfiction, where I've created a trickster character named Miss B, and you don't know whether she's a bee or a woman. So I'm playing around with different forms to tell these stories, and I think that each form will speak to a different audience. I've also done the audio version of Sweet Tea, so people like listening to me read the stories, and I think we're working on me doing the audio version of Black.Queer.Southern.Women. So I'm busy. Yes.
Thank you so much for this. I have a question, and it's actually about something from the stories that you read, and about being specifically in this space, and it's about, you mentioned boundaries, and my question is about the boundaries of class, and the boundaries of spaces that are considered academic and sometimes might be seen as being privileged in certain ways. I'm really curious, since you had so many women who desired to share their stories, did you encounter any of your interviewees' discussions around either, you know, the nature of desiring to be paid for their interviews, or were there any things where people in some way talked about or saw you as being in a more privileged position, or didn't see you as, yeah, or bougie? You know, I have to be careful with it. But
You gotta be careful.
Okay. Could you talk about that? I'm just really interested in that, the dynamic of that, especially since the oral and the textual people have class assumptions about what's in the book versus what's just been out there.
Yeah, I was very clear that I didn't have no money to pay nobody. And, you know, for those of you who are not in the academy, you don't make no money off of academic If this had been a trade book, that might be a different story. It's also a different process when you are writing a book in the context of an institution where you have to go through the IRB
Right.
and release forms and all of that. And so all of that was explained to all of the interview subjects, and that they would not be, there would be no remuneration. No one asked me about, can you pay me, or any of that. But one of the things that I try to do, and which is, that's why I'm glad that Michelle is here and other women here. I think of this as a collaborative process, that I'm curating these stories, but I'm not the only one sharing them. And as long as I can have the folks that I've interviewed in the room, in the space, particularly in academic institutions, that show that these are real people, these aren't made up, and have them also speak for themselves, I'm going to do that. The intention was never to, profit. No, I know you know that, but, not everybody understands that. And to be honest, I think that was some of the concerns of some of the people, my colleagues, who told me that I would never get women to talk to me because I would be seen as this outsider coming in to steal these women's stories. But they were wrong. Because I ain't stealing nothing. I really see this as a collaborative process. And I will also tell you, and my editor's here so you know this is true, the first iteration of the cover of the book, the women weren't feeling it. And we got their feedback and it was changed. So they were involved in every aspect of this project. It wasn't just me making these decisions. So this is our book.